Content warning. This program discusses wartime sexual violence, forced displacement, and the commodification of human beings. If these topics are distressing, please take care. You may want to skip this video. We approach this subject with restraint and a commitment to dignity for the people whose lives these records reflect. Imagine for a moment the legions returning. Banners snap in the wind, brass and leather glitter under a late sun. Trumpets sound. The city cheers. Among the triumphal column, there is another procession. Rows of women, their hands bound, faces hollowed by exhaustion and fear, walking through dust toward the heart of Rome. That image is familiar in fragments across ancient sources. What followed for many of those women was not merely injury or slavery, it was a sustained project of erasure. Their names, their bodies, their social identities, their future possibilities were stripped away and converted into ledger lines, into taxable goods, into commodities to be bought and sold. This is the claim at the center of this film. What Roman soldiers and the institutions that supported them did to captured women after conquest was in crucial moral and social senses worse than death. Not worse in a simplistic or sensational sense, but worse because it replaced life with a bureaucratic, commercial, and ritualized form of annihilation. This is not a hypothesis offered lightly. We will trace the steps of that process through documentary anchors, military reports that list captives among spoil, inventories and ship manifests that treat human beings as cargo, treatises and ledgers that set acceptable mortality losses, physician notes on chronic injury, and fragmentary personal testimonies that slip through official silences. We will move from the spectacle of domination on the battlefield to the ledger tables of empire, and from there to the marketplaces and medical wards where the long consequences were recorded. Along the way, we will ask what it meant, politically, economically, morally, for an empire that prided itself on law and civility to build itself on this machinery. If you want more unvarnished history like this, subscribe and support the channel. There will be a source list in the description for those who wish to read deeper. When a city fell, the first acts after the surrender were rarely private. Contemporary and near-contemporary authors describe a ritualized sequence. The men of the city were separated and often displayed or killed. Women and children were assembled and herded into the hands of the victors. Tacitus and other chroniclers record the theatrical quality of Roman triumphs. A people's defeat turned into the state's festival. But alongside spectacle, there was an unmistakable administrative logic. Dry terms like distribution and allocation appear in military correspondence and estate documents. These words are the language by which the state sanitizes the act of taking human beings.
A Trajan-era military report cited in the record lists thousands taken captive in a single campaign. The report does not only recount glory, it offers numbers, assignments, and destinations. That bureaucratic voice, the voice that tallies captives next to cattle and grain, matters. It tells us that this was not anarchic violence, but an organized mechanism with rules, incentives, and predictable outcomes. Captives were registered, counted, and assigned. Officers claimed portions for the army. Commanders and civilians claimed shares. That ordering alone begins the process of erasure. A name becomes a number. A person becomes an entry. Where once there may have been kinship networks, roles, and futures, now there is only an allocation. The ritual of domination could be explicitly public. Contemporary descriptions and occasional legal records indicate occasions where women were paraded, inspected, and selected. Such scenes were not only about satisfying soldiers' appetites, but about marking a conquered population as property. In some cases, officers used marks or brands to indicate ownership or destination. Branding was a visible administrative practice, a mark that encoded who had the right to sell, to assign, to profit. A mark made an individual legible to market systems and invisible as a social person. After the immediate ritual came the long logistics of making these captives part of the imperial economy. Marches to ports, crowded and disease-ridden, are recorded in several itineraries and accounts. Ship manifests survive that read like inventories, lines of barley, amphorae of oil, horses, and alongside them, named groups of captives listed in the same hand. One Alexandria inventory cited in our sources lists wine, wheat, and a number of women side by side. These documents show the administrative equivalence of human beings and other goods in the eyes of the bureaucracy. The merchandise of empire moved by the same systems of loading, storage, and sale. Estate management treatises and account books show how this system was calibrated. An estate handbook that circulated among Roman managers, attributed in the source material to a woman named Camilla in our transcript, records what was considered an acceptable loss rate for captive labor during transport. The formulation is chilling because it converts death and disappearance into a calculable cost of doing business. When a ledger lists an acceptable attrition percentage, it implies that some fraction of these human beings were expected to die in transit, to be sold into the worst kinds of labor, or simply to disappear without recourse. That calculus turns human life into a variable in financial planning. Ship cargoes move to waiting warehouses and ports, where again we encounter the blunt vocabulary of commerce. Women appear on shipping manifests with destinations: brothels, private households, mines, workshops. In ports and urban centers, storage facilities documented stock, quality, and defects. A military supply chain treated captives as part of its inventory. Sometimes the manifests are specific. A note will register the number of captives, their origin, and even a crude classification of health or age. That administrative detail enabled a market to function. Buyers could calculate price, owners could claim tax deductions, and officials could remit the portion due to the treasury. The marketplace itself was the public face of this commodification. Auction scenes are attested in a variety of anecdotal and documentary materials. Witnesses write of stalls, of brokers, of bidders who appraised captives with the same gestures that might assess a slave's strength or a horse's condition. Graffiti and inscriptions from places such as Pompeii, part of the archaeological backdrop we use to imagine these markets, record names and brothel advertisements alongside mundane business notices. Inscriptions and papyri also attest to the existence of regulated brothels and state-sanctioned facilities where captive women were employed. Some cities taxed brothels, some licensed them. Roman law and municipal ordinances turned prostitution into a taxable, regulated aspect of urban life. That formal arrangement created bureaucratic incentives to funnel captives into those systems, incentives that made commodification profitable and reproducible. The fates that awaited captive women were varied, but often grim. Auctioned to private households, some were forced into domestic servitude, where their freedom was permanently curtailed. Others were parceled into brothels or the temple economies that practiced ritualized sexual service. Still others were sent to mines, workshops, or agricultural estates, where forced labor shortened lives and ruptured families. The mortality patterns recorded in estate accounts and ostraca are stark. Captives sent to the most dangerous labor had far higher recorded death rates. A mining ledger might list workers, then cross out names when they failed to return from the shafts. A shipping ledger might annotate losses during transit as perished or missing. These administrative marks register lives ended or erased in the margins of commerce. Medical evidence adds another layer. Physicians and medical treatises examined and recorded the physical consequences of the conditions imposed on captive women. Saurinus of Ephesus, a Roman physician whose treatise on gynecology survives in fragments, describes chronic ailments consistent with repeated physical trauma, infections, and the long-term complications of forced sexual exposure. His clinical pages do not indulge in moralizing. They record symptoms, complications, and sometimes prognosis. That clinical voice confirms what the ledgers suggest. Captivity and the conditions imposed upon captives produced enduring physical harm.
Where the ledger marks lost or defective, the physician records recurring infection, infertility, and chronic pain. Equally important, we have voices that reach us in spite of the system's silences. A legionary writing under the name Marcus Flavius in a fragmentary letter offers a glimpse into the mentality on the ground. He writes in the terse, practical language of a soldier, noting the distribution of spoil and offering offhand remarks about claims taken and the cargo shipped. His letter is not an apology, nor is it a confession. It is a small artifact of normalization, the everyday words soldiers used while participating in and facilitating the trade. Those fragmentary documents let us see how ordinary actors made sense of what they did, as duty, as gain, as routine. Even rarer are testimonies from captives themselves. Blandina, an early Christian slave and martyr whose testimony is preserved in the record, describes a life of repeated violence in the arena and in captivity. Her voice, transmitted through hagiography, slips between the categories assigned by others. She speaks of endurance, of resistance, and of human bonds formed in the margins of captivity. Blandina's testimony is not a statistical record, it is a moral one. It reminds us that behind every ledger entry was a person with relationships, memories, and a sense of self that the system relentlessly sought to extinguish. The historical record also preserves episodes of resistance. In the Iberian provinces, during a revolt associated in some sources with a leader named Boudicca, Enslaved women and men rebelled against their captors and sought to reclaim their lives. Reports of such uprisings are fragmentary and sometimes recorded only as military summaries of disturbances, but they pierce the narrative of passive submission. Resistance took many forms: flight, suicide, revolt, small acts of minute sabotage, and these acts complicate any narrative that reduces captives to mere objects. Yet even resistance itself was met with institutionalized cruelty. Punishments were public and often designed to deter emulation, converting violence into civic pedagogy. Why was this system so tenacious? Part of the answer lies in the legal and fiscal architecture of the Roman state. Roman law treated some categories of captives as legally sellable property, and municipal regulations often formalized brothels, slave markets, and apprenticeships that exploited captive labor. Taxation fed the incentive structures. Brothels paid fees, slave sales generated taxable transactions, estates could deduct losses against revenue. In this machinery, the state's fiscal health was entangled with the commerce in human lives. When the treasury benefits from human displacement, institutional pressures align to make the practice not exceptional, but systemic. A brutal logic followed. Commodification was supported by administrative habits, profit motives, and legal sanction.
This was not merely the violence of soldiers in the moment of triumph. It was the extension of military conquest into the civic economy. Military reports, estate manuals, and urban ordinances show a continuity between battlefield capture and urban integration as commodified labor. The image of a triumphant army must therefore be read against the ledger table. Official glory on one side, taxable human cargo on the other. Historians like Ammianus Marcellinus and Tacitus offer commentary that, read carefully, reveals ambivalence about these practices. They admire Roman order and prowess, yet occasionally gesture toward the human cost. Modern commentators, including Carlo Ginzburg, cited in our materials, have used such disjunctures to ask larger questions about the boundary between the sacred and the profane in early societies. Ginzburg's reflections, adapted to our context, suggest that the state's claims to sacred mission and civilizing purpose often mask profane systems of extraction, the rhetoric of civilization cloaked a violent economy. The moral consequences for the individuals affected were profound. For women captured in warfare, the loss went beyond physical injury. Identity was stripped, names disappeared from records, kinship ties were severed, reproductive futures were controlled by other people's economic needs. A woman who might have expected to marry, to bear children within a social network, to inherit or to pass on cultural practices, found herself reallocated to a household that would deny those trajectories. The chronic conditions documented by physicians, together with the psychological consequences we can infer from testimonies and patterns of behavior, show a life forcibly narrowed to the functions demanded by owners, brokers, or market forces. That narrowing, the removal of social roles, the destruction of future possibilities, the loss of bodily autonomy, is central to the claim that what happened could be worse than death. Death is, in an immediate sense, an end. Erasure is an ongoing diminishment that continues through time. We must be careful in how we phrase this, because the record requires caution. We do not claim that every captive suffered identically, nor that all choices were impossible under slavery. The documentary record shows variation. Some captives might be integrated into households where they acquired new skills, or even gained a measure of relative safety compared to the horrors of war. But the institutional patterns, inventories, tax records, medical treatises, shipping manifests, show a widespread system organized around dispossession. Where the system was at its most intense, survival might look like a series of humiliations, chronic illness, reproductive control, and restricted social identity. In those cases, social death, the loss of recognized personhood and social status, often accompanied or even exceeded biological death in its cruelty. The silence of posterity amplifies that cruelty. In centuries of historical memory, school books, and cultural production, the materiality of conquest, soldiers, triumphs, civic monuments, tends to be foregrounded. The ledger, the manifest, the physician's marginal notes, and the graffiti that testify to private economies are often omitted. Films and popular histories celebrate Roman order and engineering while neglecting the price paid by the conquered. This historiographical choice is significant. What a culture remembers shapes how it imagines itself. By forgetting or downplaying these aspects, later generations inherit a skewed picture, one of civilization without cost. What might it mean, then, to remember? Part of remembering is methodological. reading the paperwork, the medical fragments, the graffiti, and the martyr testimonies with a view to reconstructing the lived experience of captivity. Part of it is moral, acknowledging that celebrated institutions may have depended on systems of extraction that inflicted prolonged harm. And part of it is political, recognizing that the mechanisms which normalized and bureaucratized violence in the past have echoes in later forms of state-sponsored or market-driven dehumanization. We should, however, avoid facile analogies. Modern legal contexts, human rights frameworks, and ethical discourse are different from those of the ancient Mediterranean. Yet there are structural continuities worth noting: the bureaucratic normalization of violence, the temptation to see people as economic units, the ease with which law can codify inequality. Such parallels are not identity claims, they are prompts for reflection. They ask us whether institutions we admire can coexist with practices we would condemn, and what responsibility modern societies have to reconstruct a fuller moral history. Returning to fragments brings us closer to the human scale. Marcus Flavius's letter, spare and transactional, reveals the mentality of a soldier who parcels life into allotments and cargo. Blandina's testimony, preserved in Martyr Acts, contains a human voice insisting on the possibility of dignity amid torment. Saurinus's notes give us the clinical aftermath, the bodies that continue to bear witness in their ailments. The Alexandria Inventory and the estate treatises show the economic logic that undergirded this scale of violence. When these documents are read together, they produce a composite portrait: ritual humiliation followed by bureaucratic commodification, then market distribution, and finally medical, social, and intergenerational consequences. There are moments in the record that are particularly revealing. Consider a shipping manifest that lists amphoria of wine, a herd of horses, and 89 women, a catalog that flattens living people into commodities alongside produce. Or an estate ledger that sets an expected loss rate for transport. Such a figure tells us that some deaths were baked into business plans.
Or a brothel inscription that advertises services while municipal tax rolls note fees collected. The state was not merely indifferent, it profited. These archival traces are not salacious curiosities, they are the evidence of a system. What finally does it mean to say the treatment was worse than death? It is to insist that a society can inflict upon people a condition in which they are stripped of their names, their social futures, and much of their bodily autonomy, at the same time as their lives are extended on the order books of commerce. It is to assert that the violence was not only physical, but administrative, legal, and economic, that it reached into the waifs of daily paperwork and the architecture of tax and law. Death ends a story. Bureaucratic erasure writes over it. The moral crescendo of this history asks a simple question. When an empire crowns itself with wreaths and monuments, who pays the bill? If we allow the triumphal narrative to stand alone, we erase a central dimension of imperial life. If we read the ledgers, the physician's scraps, the soldier's notes, and the captive's testimony, a different picture emerges, one in which glory is bought with human lives converted into goods, with identities dissolved by paperwork, and with futures given a price tag. We cannot restore the names fully. Many will remain anonymous in the archives, but we can insist that the record itself be read honestly. We can demand that the narrative of ancient achievement include the shadows behind its marble facades. Remembering is not a matter of sentimental guilt alone. It is an ethical commitment to tell a fuller truth. So I return to the opening scene, the banners, the drums, the column of women walking through dust into the city. Imagine a ledger kept that day, names crossed out, numbers tallied, destinations assigned. The triumph paraded success, the ledger recorded displacement. Between spectacle and paper, between trumpet and manifest, an institutional machinery converted people into profit and into silent entries. That machinery did more than kill. It reorganized life so that survival often meant perpetual diminishment. If this is a history you want to explore further, read the sources linked in the description. They include military reports, the Alexandria Inventory, the estate management treatise attributed in our materials,
medical fragments of Sorinus of Ephesus, and the fragments of Marcus Flavius and Blandinus' testimony. Share this video to help break the historical silence, and subscribe if you want more investigations that reckon honestly with the past. We close with one last question. How will we remember the cost of our own histories, not only the monuments, but the ledgers that lie beneath them? And what responsibilities do we inherit when praise for civilization comes with a ledger full of anonymous names?